population of Finnish settlers in Ontario more than tripled between 1911 and 1931. Many came because of the conflict between the Red and White Finns, which resulted in the Civil War of 1918. Others came to fulfill a dream. This is the story of Kustaa Heikkila and his search for a new life in the Canadian wilderness.
I had no plans at first. It was more like drifting with the wind without purpose. By the time I was 12, my parents were dead. My brother and sister and I were too young to operate the farm, so our kinfolk auctioned everything off. Oskar and Fina went to live with relatives, and I stayed for 5 years with the local blacksmith's family. I learned a lot, to cultivate and love the land. Looking, I don't know for what, I decided in 1923 to emigrate to Canada. I had been called for military training, which would delay my leaving for 2 years. In desperation, I asked my brother Oskar, who was underage for the military, if I could use his passport. He agreed, but the passport officer knew of my brother, so I had to be careful. On a stormy day early in December, I went to the passport office and completed the application. With my cap pulled down over my face, I approached the officer's desk. He gave me a suspicious stare. Quickly, I paid the bill and no questions were asked. In 2 weeks, I received my passport, then ordered my ticket from the steamship line. I arrived at the docks in Turku. There, I met dozens of others like myself. So the big adventure started, and I, with my new identity and friends, traveled safely from Turku right up to North Bay, Ontario. Only 4 days after my arrival in South Porcupine, I became a miner at Dome Mines. At first, I saved money, but $4 a day was a lot then, and soon I was gambling and visiting bootleggers. After 13 months of working underground, I quit, and with little money in my pocket, I moved on with my friends, Matt and Gust. It was winter, and we were lucky to find woodcutting jobs in South River. We were all inexperienced, and our biggest problem was keeping the saw sharp enough to cut through the frozen trees. A few months later, I received some great news. My brother Oskar had arrived in South Porcupine and wanted to come down and cut pulpwood with us. By the time he joined us, it was July, and we were playing rather than working. In a nearby river, we shed our clothes and sang at the top of our lungs, just enjoying the good life. One night, Gus told us a story that would soon change the course of my life. 15 miles northwest of Iroquois Falls, a community of Finnish settlers were carving homesteads out of the wilderness. The government was selling 80-acre lots for 50 cents an acre. Some of the settlers were already cutting and selling their pulpwood to the Abitibi Paper Company. This news was most interesting to me. A place to live and work on my own land had been my dream for quite a while. This could fulfill my dream, this place called Sisu. With a letter of recommendation in my pocket and a hope for adventure, we left South River at the end of July, planning to head out west for the harvest.
We went out west and we hadn't got too much money, so we had to beat the freight train like hundreds of people did that time, you know, and there's nothing exceptional, you know. We never get caught or nothing, no problem at all, except, you know, we were kind of scary because we never done anything like that before.
We started to walk the tracks. Freight trains came and went, but they were traveling too fast for us. That night, we reached an area with a water tower and waited. Finally, a train stopped to fill up. As it started to move away, we spotted an empty car with its doors open. We jumped in. Soon, we were old pros at beating the trains, and it wasn't long before we reached Brandon, Manitoba. There we met others waiting for the harvest to begin. Many were not young lads like ourselves, but old hands organized into so-called jungle gangs. They would raid neighboring gardens and farms, grabbing chickens and whatever else they could to cook up back at the base camp. Our money grew thin, but with the harvest begun, our letter of recommendation got the four of us jobs within an hour. The job was stooking the sheaves of hay, $3 a day with room and board. Workdays were hard and long, 5 in the morning until 9 at night, with a half-hour rest during the day. 3 weeks of that was enough, and Oscar and I called it quits. Gust I didn't see for 20 years. Matt I never saw again. I heard that he lost an arm beating a train, then went back to Finland where he died. We arrived in Moose Jaw ready to work. New underwear, shirts, and overalls made us feel decent again, and within a few days we were working for a Swedish couple who came over in 1903. One evening at dinner, Mr. Held told us how he had built his first house of sod. Buying lumber was out of the question for a penniless immigrant. Things were even tougher back then. When the snow began, I left my brother and the Swedish couple and started back to South Porcupine. In Moose Jaw, I met an old friend, and together we made our way back to Ontario in style. The engineers let us sit in the coal compartment, out of the wind. Working again at the mines in South Porcupine, I decided to live in town. The Finns had established 2 cooperative rooming houses to separate the red Finns from the whites. Emotions from the Civil War still ran high, even in Canada in 1925. I didn't have much time for politics after August 1926. Amalia arrived. 12 years before, we'd sat beside each other for a class photo, but she had no interest in boys then. Now, 5,000 miles from home, fate brought us together again. We became good friends straight away, and within a week or two, I could call her as my girlfriend. While I labored in the mines, Amalia picked up a job as a dishwasher in a lumber camp. I still wasn't very good at saving, but my bad habits were changing, and I gave Amalia a few dollars each week. Soon we were married, and within a year our son Walter was born. His bubbling curiosity and boundless energy added something special to our lives. I now wanted to find a proper home for my family. A series of misfortunes pushed me towards my dream. The mill at Dome Mines burned down in November 1929. Most of the workforce, myself included, was immediately laid off. A month earlier, the Great Depression had begun. Many people lost everything. We were more fortunate than most. Shortly after the fire, I was talking to a friend, and the name Sisu came up again. He told me 2 families had given up and abandoned their lots. I decided it was time to seek out this place called Sisu. I often remember that first journey to Sisu. Here on the shores of the Abitibi River, I met Otto Leinonen. He agreed to take me downriver to Mr. and Mrs. Hompa, who would show me the property. Even now, when I travel on the river, it always brings back the emotions of that first voyage. The beauty and tranquility I shall never forget. It was fall then. I walked up from the river and was greeted by the Hompas, who kindly gave me a nice hot dinner. Afterwards, we walked up to the property I'd waited so long to see. There was an old log house in a clearing. The windows and doors had been taken, and many of the floorboards were missing. Tar paper that had covered the roof was torn to shreds. Not quite a home for a family. Still, I loved it. The price was $75 for the property with $25 down, but the land office in Cochrane wouldn't give me a permit to cut wood until I came up with the money. I went to the office of the Hawk Lake Lumber Company and pleaded for a $25 advance. The boss refused. However, one of the other chaps was impressed with my enthusiasm and loaned me the money. I was now in business for myself. They paid $6.50 a cord. Not great, but we now had a home and wouldn't go hungry. The following day, I carried cooking utensils, tools, nails, and tar paper 15 miles back into the wilderness. Although I was tired, I had the roll of tar paper cut up and nailed down by nightfall. Working 16 hours a day, I had the floor roughed in 4 days later. I hung a few oat bags in the door and windows to keep the wind and suddenly cold weather out. I survived the long, chilly nights, sleeping on a mattress of moss between the stove and the wall. In a few days, when the narrow part of the river had frozen over, I borrowed Mr. Hompa's skis and slowly made my way across. The ice sank under my weight, but didn't break. I breathed a sigh of relief when I reached the far shore, for now I could get back to my family. I bought a horse and sleigh to help me with my work. It was getting late in the cutting season, so I had to hurry. When Amalia, Walter, and I reached the shores of the Abitibi, the weather had turned mild. The ice seemed only good enough for people to walk on. Reluctantly, I decided to leave the horse in a nearby stable. Then we loaded Walter's little sled with the most needed items. Downriver, we were greeted by the Honpads at Ottolenonen. He offered to help pull the sled to the cabin. Arriving at our new home, I proudly lifted the oat bag door and invited everybody in. The sight inside was even worse than I remembered. I looked at Amalia. She was crying. We quickly fell into a routine. During the day, I worked in the bush. At night, I smoothed out the floor with a plane and joined the planks to a tight fit. Amalia soon loved Sisula as I did. Spring was approaching, and working alone, I realized that I wouldn't meet my quota. I asked Mr. Hompa if he could spare one of his men. Vesa was a sensitive man with an open heart towards the sufferers of the Depression. In 1930, there were no jobs. Vesa thought our economic system was wrong and often talked politics. The socialist-led movement was urging workers to emigrate to Soviet Karelia, a Russian province bordering on Finland. I was unable to talk him out of going despite many heated discussions. Vesa left us in the spring. Time went by with no word from him. Many of the immigrants to Karelia were fleeced of their belongings and shipped off to dig canals or work on communal farms. We learned that Vesa was gunned down by Russian border guards while trying to escape. What a contrast. In Canada, we were free to pursue our dreams. Even though times were tough, there was always hope. With summer approaching, Amalia decided to take Walter to visit her sister in South Porcupine. I walked with them to the station. Then, on my way back home, I noticed a thick black cloud of smoke. At first, I wasn't too concerned, but the closer I got to our property, the faster my heart raced. Our house had burnt down. I was desolated. As I poked through the ashes, I could see the twisted frame of our bed and the aluminum kettle, which was now just a slab of metal. I arrived in South Porcupine covered in black soot and dirt. As I explained what happened, Amalia's face filled with despair. Later, she regained her sense of humor. When mentioning how hot the fire must have been to melt the aluminum kettle, she sighed. Yes, just the wooden grip remained. Everyone burst into laughter. Fortunately, Mr. Hompa had just bought another piece of property from the government. Their old house would be vacant, so he suggested we move in until our new one was completed. Within a few days, we were with our friends again in Sisula. Building a new house was harder than I expected, and the winter came early. It sapped our strength and resources, and by the time I paid my debts, I had little left for the summer. My dream, life on a farm, would have to wait. Reluctantly, I decided to get a job back in the mines. Amalia gave birth to our daughter Riley in the winter of 1932. This little person brought us great joy. I got away to Sisula as often as I could for the next 2 years. When I heard that the pulp prices were rising, I made a decision. My friends thought I was crazy, but time has proven to me that the higher wages in the mines could have cost me my life. Many people who worked underground eventually died from silica dust poisoning. I longed for the freedom of Sisu, so I quit the mines for the last time in the spring of 1933. With Riley in a backsack, the four of us arrived home on May the 4th. Work began immediately, with Amalia fixing up the inside while I prepared the garden. How happy we felt to be back. With Amalia and Walter's help, our 150-cord quota was cut before Christmas. That winter was the coldest on record. Otto was fed up, too much work with poor returns. I decided to buy his equipment and stick it out. I hired workers with 3 teams of horses to haul out the timber. Times were difficult then. Some of the single men had come to make enough money to go back to Finland and marry their sweethearts. The Depression changed all that. Many became bitter, disillusioned with life. It was April before our men could get back to their own homes. In the fall of 1933, we petitioned the government to establish a school in our area. With Walter close to school age and a dozen neighboring kids growing up without a proper education, it was important to us. 2 years later, our schoolhouse opened. For the children to get there, I had to clear a path 3 miles long through the bush. Walter and Riley took that trail until the schoolhouse was closed. They were always eager to go, even on stormy days when the trail had to be opened up by ski. During those early years in Sisu, there was always plenty of work to do, but we did have a busy social life, especially on Saturday nights.
I can remember the coffee pot always was on. When the visitors came, they would come in droves from South Porcupine, old friends of mother and father. And then we would be scrounging for places to sleep. So they'd be sleeping in the hay barn, in the steam bath, and 4 in a bed, sometimes crossways. But we always made do. The sauna was a real social event in those days. There were a few neighbors that were close enough, and we would exchange visits different Saturdays. And then there'd always be the coffee after. It was always the highlight of the sauna evening.
We started to deliver cream in the summer of '38 with 4 milk cows. There was still no road, so we had to row the cream 4 miles downriver to where the creamery truck would pick it up. Although we only made $5 a week, we still had the pulpwood to make ends meet.
Well, to deliver the cream, we used to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to meet the truck at 6. But I didn't mind that because the river was so beautiful in the morning, with the birds singing and the water was so calm. We used to go twice a week, and I always looked forward to going.
The wilderness wasn't the only thing we had to fight to survive. Sometimes it was government bureaucracy. I had ordered a fishnet from the Eaton's catalog. On the order form, you had to give a license number. I wrote down the only number I had. Now suddenly, a game warden appeared on my property. "Where did you get that fishnet from?" he asked. "Eaton's," I said, somewhat puzzled. "Eaton's is not supposed to give you one without a license. Did you give them a number you didn't have?" "Oh, I gave them this one," I replied, showing him my radio license. He chuckled. "Now I've seen everything. I guess I'll have to delete this charge, but I must fine you for that gill net. It's illegal." I exploded. Illegal? What's wrong with you fellows? Here you are chasing a poor homesteader that's trying to open up and develop this country, who's making ends meet by catching suckers, and you want to fine him? Companies are killing them by the thousands. There are dead fish everywhere. Why don't you do something about that? Well, I don't think I could have stunned him better if I'd had a sledgehammer. At first, he was speechless. Then he admitted, "You had a right to say all that, and I'm sorry. But our office received a letter about your license and nets, so I had to come." There seemed to be 2 sets of rules, one for the big companies and another for us. I paid the $17 fine with great reluctance. When the schoolhouse closed down in 1941, Walter and Riley took correspondence courses up to grade 10. The school had fulfilled an important need for all those kids in the backwoods, and there were other advantages.
No, I never felt deprived being brought up in the backwoods. We were always busy. making boats, hunting, fishing, skiing. We did a lot of things that the kids in the cities, towns couldn't do. There was never any doubt that I would not go to university.
After studying advanced physics at the University of Toronto, Walter became a professor. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on the Northern Lights. As the years went by, the pulpwood cutting came to an end. One by one, our neighbors left. We stayed, living in relative isolation, making a small income from our dairy and beef herds. Eventually, we were alone, but not lonely. We loved our home, our animals, and enjoyed their company. They were all part of the dream I had so many years ago, to make a go of it. Over 150 families had lived in Sisu. We were the last to leave. Sisu had provided us with the opportunity of living in freedom. We can sit back, proudly watching our family as they build a life on the foundations of our experiences of long ago. Canada allowed us to fulfill our dreams, a country where our children and their children can realize their own.
Father always taught us to be independent. And when you look back on it, it actually seems almost fun, most things, although there were hardships. I think people were free to do really what they wanted to do or when they wanted, and still everybody made a living at it, which really is what it's all about.
Sisu is a Finnish word referring to the strength, fortitude, and determination of the Finns to live as a free and independent people. Kustaa Heikkila lived that dream in Sisu.